All right, everybody. Hello, my name is Dennis Sullivan. Thank you for joining us today at InfoCon. I am the Senior Assistant Program Director for Graduate Admissions and Recruitment over here at the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering at IUPUI. Yes, that is quite the mouthful. Today, we are going to be having a presentation by Dr. Kyle Jones, who's going to be talking about exactly what you see on your screen right now. So I'm going to go ahead and throw this over to Dr. Jones. If you have any questions throughout the entire presentation, please go ahead and throw them into the Q&A, and we will try and address them as we can throughout the presentation. And if we don't get to it during the presentation, there will also be a time at the end for general questions, things like that. If anyone has not used a Zoom webinar before, if you would like to ask your question by voice instead of text, you can click the button that says raise hand. We'd be able to help unmute you at that time, so you'd be able to ask a question that way. If you want to ask your question by text, the Q&A at the bottom of your screen is perfect. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Jones.
All right. Thank you, Dennis. Thanks to everybody who chose to come to the session today, and I'll echo Dennis for our folks on the East Coast. Thanks for sticking with us throughout to the end of your work day there. And thanks to everybody else. So I am Dr. Kyle Jones. I'm an associate professor within the Department of Library and Information Science and the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering. And today I'm going to talk about a presentation that I've entitled Prioritizing Privacy in Library Science, Information Science, and Data Science Curricula. And I'll start this presentation by talking about my research agenda and how that research agenda influences how I think about prioritizing privacy in these three interconnected areas. So the first thing I want to say is that all of the slides are available in my OSF research repository, which Dennis just put into the chat for you to access. There's some other interesting stuff in that research repository as well, too, but the slides are there, and that's good to take for your own perusal at a later time, because it does include some references that you may find useful for yourself or for others. And Dennis says we can also email the link out as well, and that is definitely true. Share widely. Don't just keep to yourself. A little bit about me. So my area of research is focused on educational data mining, learning analytics practices, student data governance, and how these things are related to educational technology practices. And I take an information ethics and policy approach to these things. So I'm primarily interested in privacy, which is what I'm going to talk about today, but I have some other kind of related or peripheral issues that I'm interested in as well, like trust and autonomy. I got earned, I should say, my BA from Elmhurst College in Elmhurst, Illinois, my master's in library information science from Dominican University in River Forest, Illinois, before transitioning above the border to Wisconsin at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's iSchool, where I earned my PhD. And now I'm at Indiana University at the Indianapolis campus as an associate professor, where I do teach information policy and database design and information architecture and intellectual freedom. I have my research site there, which is thecorkboard.org, which has a lot of information about me, of course, but it also has some other resources that you might find useful, reading lists that I've curated over the years, so on and so forth. And then those three URLs below it are the projects that I am going to highlight today: Data Doubles, Prioritizing Privacy, and Datafied Classroom. So going on just a little bit about my school. So we're an informatics school, and so that means that we focus on society's use of information and communication technologies. The engineering has just been added recently, and so we may spin up an engineering program later on. I'll leave it to Dennis to talk about why we're called the School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering. I'll just move past that for now. But at the present, we have 4 departments: Library and Information Science, which is the one I am situated in, Human-Centered Computing, Health Informatics, and Computer Science, which will be a new department that will be offering programs for starting next year, I believe. So I want to talk about the presentation scope. So InfoCon is kind of an interesting conference, if you want to put it that way, because it's a, what do we do in information science kind of conference. There's no real specific theme, so to speak. There's a lot of different interested stakeholders. Some of you may be students, some of you may be faculty, some of you may be doctoral students or postdocs or something like that. So this presentation is kind of for all of you, which means it's got a lot of different themes to it. So potential students, grad students, and faculty, kind of the focus here is, or for what I thought about as I put this together was, what might potential students want to know about what faculty research? And for graduate students, the question for you may be, what could I research in the space that Kyle is going to talk about? And for faculty, I thought maybe you would think, how could I expand on this topic in my own research or from my own perspective? And how do I address privacy issues in my department's curricula, or, even within your school or your university in different types of policy, as we'll talk about. So it'll touch on a bunch of different stuff. Come at this presentation with your own point of view and definitely ask questions from your own point of view. So here's the agenda here. I'm going to talk about learning analytics and student privacy, which is my primary research agenda. I'm going to give you some foundational information, some contextual knowledge, and then I'm going to highlight some of the major findings from my 3 big projects that I've been fortunate enough to be grant funded to do from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And I'm going to talk about some of the major findings from that. And then I'm going to roll that into the second part, which is, what do we do with this information and how might it motivate some of the things that we do in library science, information science, and data science curricula? And then I'll take a Q&A at the end. So please do throw those questions in the Q&A so we have something to chat about at the end. All right, learning analytics and student privacy. What is Kyle talking about? So let's define learning analytics a little bit. So this is a commonly cited definition from George Siemens, which you may say, if you know learning analytics, was one of the creators of this space, of this field of research, of technological design of practice. So George says, learning analytics is the measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of data about learners and their contexts for purposes of understanding and optimizing learning and the environments in which it occurs. So a couple of things I always like to point out about this definition, right? It's not necessarily about learning outcomes. It could be, right? It could be about saying, well, how do we get Kyle from a B grade to an A grade? What kind of data can we analyze? Or people like Kyle, how can we improve their grades, right? That's it's a learning outcome, or at least the grade is a proxy to understand learning outcomes and the success. But it's also about, as George writes, the context of learning. So the classroom, the library, the writing center, the social spaces on campus, so on and so forth. It's about those contexts and how they interact with the educational process, and how learning analytics can be used to understand how they, affect learning outcomes or learning growth, and also how you can optimize the university and its spaces and its places and its resources so that learning does improve. So it's a lot more than just, understanding an individual student, a subgroup of students, and what they're learning. It's also about just the institution as a whole, and the process of learning and all of the environmental and social and other factors that go into it. And how do we use data and information to inform those things? So there are some different kind of strategies that learning analytics uses to accomplish its goals. So the first is to describe what is happening in the learning, environment or the learning behavior. So we use descriptive statistics to do that. We will also want to ask, why did something happen? Why did Kyle get a C in Math 101? Or why did people like Kyle get a C in Math 101 when that's an important foundational course or something like that? So we will look at inferential statistics to see what is statistically valid or statistically powerful in determining which, of those factors we need to isolate or work on. The third thing would be to ask questions like, what is likely to happen in the future, right? Given what we know about Kyle and people like Kyle and where he's at on his path, how do we predict how Kyle will do in the future when he takes Math 201 or 301 or whatever the case may be? And that's when we get into predictive modeling and more machine learning type of approaches to learning analytics. And also into prescription, right? If we are able to predict what is going to happen, then what can we do with regard to learning analytics to make sure that something is going to happen or is not going to happen, like a negative behavior? So we can use machine learning and artificial intelligence to an extent to drive interventions, right? So we can say, okay, well, Kyle's predicted not to do well in 201. Let's preemptively give him some more resources. Let's preemptively connect him with other people on campus who may be able to help him find success in these other courses. Or to provide a personalized curriculum or personalized resources according to my needs, as the case may be. So a lot of different strategies going on here in learning analytics. So to do these things, it obviously requires data. And for some of them, like if we're going to predict a certain outcome, we need a lot of data. We need historical data so that our modeling is correct. It's mathematically on par with the power we need to make those predictions. So a lot of these things are probably pretty obvious to you in terms of what the institution does have access to about a given student: biographic information, demographic information, some economic information, especially if they're filling out applications for financial aid or for scholarships. Some biometric information. This gets into a little bit of a different area that maybe we've never thought about before, but it does happen sometimes. So facial recognition. Do note that all students, typically at most institutions, have to get a picture taken and put on their student ID. So that picture is in a database. That database can then be used to train facial recognition systems for security or some other purposes. The other biological information is a little bit different because that takes some sensors, so a Fitbit or something like that. And we have seen instances of Fitbits being used for very specific studies in higher ed. System interactions are the most widespread source of data for learning analytics. It's basically click streams, right? So when are you clicking on what resource in, say, the learning management system or some online technology like a database or what have you? And that always keeps a historical record of, the individual person who clicked on what, when, and what the following behavior was. We also have a lot of environmental interaction data in higher ed. So again, within those student IDs, there's RFID chips that are put in there so that students can gain access to rooms or buildings on campus. They can put their ID card up to the sensor, it lets them in, creates a data stream. We also have Wi-Fi connections on campus. We're probably one of the most sophisticated Wi-Fi environments in the world because of how much our students rely, and faculty and staff, on access to the internet to teach and learn and provide information resources. And a lot of times we don't let just anybody use our Wi-Fi because of the risks involved, but we require logging into systems to verify our identities so that we can connect to the Wi-Fi. So being able to understand, what clusters of individual students are using what Wi-Fi or what time, for instance, can possibly show us some social interaction data, as I've listed there as well. And of course, because we require students to use our email systems, our calendaring systems, oftentimes we have some communications data that we could potentially pull from. Though I will say that I have not heard anybody studying communications data from the university's email system. And then we have obviously academic data. We've got grades, we've got course histories, we've got chosen programs of study. So what does this all mean? Why are we doing this stuff? So learning analytics can be used for institutional targets, which is to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of programs, of courses, of the resources that we fund to support our students. And then as a result, to make changes to those things, to provide more resources or less resources, or cut programs or cut centers, or whatever the case may be, because we can start to see how these things actually inform the educational learning outcomes for the student. We can also use this data, this information that we glean from learning analytics, to make arguments, to our stakeholders, either our legislators or other funders, about the success of what we do, and to improve things like our key performance indicators that are relevant to our institutions, like our rankings, right? Which is related again to enrollment and retention and things of that nature. There are student targets involved too, like learning outcomes or personal outcomes like time to degree or retention, which I would say are also institutional targets. And as I said previously, to enact personalized resources and programs of study. It can also help our educational sciences departments to run large-scale analytic research projects. And I've seen this at Indiana University. Ben Motz does a good job of doing these kind of large-scale research projects with learning analytics practices. So it's more than just learning, as you can kind of see from that. We're looking at admissions and kind of optimizing yields. We're looking at advising, like, can we predict which course a student is going to succeed in, or which program a student is going to succeed in, right? Is Kyle Jones going to be predicted to do well in a math program? And if he's not, maybe we should do something about that. It could help with instruction, engagement, grades, attendance, institutional research, to help with retention studies, or to find out, which key courses are creating blockages towards further success in an academic program, and also even for our libraries to help them understand, what students, or perhaps not what specific students, but that students or certain populations of students are using their physical resources, their study rooms, or just their general stacks, whatever the case may be, and how they're interacting and to what degree with the digital resources that are provided by libraries. So I think there are some clear privacy problems that come up with this. Any type of data practice that uses personally identifiable information, or information that could possibly later on be re-identified if it was de-identified at the get-go, creates privacy problems. And I think one of the first ones is that there are not clear limits on control. And what I mean by that is that when we often talk about privacy, we're talking about one's ability to limit control of data or information about themselves. And in this case, students really don't have the ability to limit control about data and information about themselves. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about policy. There are transparency issues. Students don't know what their institutions are doing with data and information about them, and to what ends. There's no real consent mechanism involved. Students can't say, hey, I don't want to use the learning management system because you're gathering data on me. It's like, well, the learning management system, whether that's Canvas or D2L or whatever the case may be, is kind of a required tool to use, even if you're not in an online course these days. There are autonomy issues at play here, right? If we're trying to predict if a student is going to be successful in a program of study, and then try to persuade them one way or the other to not pursue that program, well, that's restricting their autonomy to pursue their, the students' interests. And we don't want that in higher ed. That's the purpose of higher ed, is to really allow students to pursue their interests, to grow as personal individuals, as professionals, and to pursue their own goals, whatever their reasoning is for those goals. It's not really our decision to make as faculty members or advisors. That's up to them. And there's trust problems, right? If you don't have a lot of transparency, if you can't practice informed consent, then why should students trust their institutions to use data appropriately? And of course, the systems that I kind of highlighted, they create a lot of different data and information, which then creates questions about access. Who's accessing the data, under what constraints, and how are they using it? That's a natural privacy question. And then, because a lot of third parties are involved in higher education and the provision of education to undergrads and grads alike, there's a question of how those third parties are using data, and how they're keeping, storing, retaining, whatever you want to say there, or deleting data, and what their downstream sharing practices are like, and what kind of protections are put in place on the data when they are shared downstream, if they are at all. And then one of the things that's a little bit more theoretical, though of course limits on control is a theoretical point on privacy, but contextual integrity breaks. So this is looking at Helen Nissenbaum's framework of contextual integrity, and how she says that our privacy rights and expectations are determined based on the norms that we have constructed over time within a given context. And so I'd argue that a lot of the norms around data sharing and use within higher ed are changing with regard to student privacy, and that sets up a prima facie argument that privacy is being impinged upon. And so we need to have a conversation, establish new norms with students, and ensure that our privacy protections are in alignment with their expectations. So there are a few legal safeguards in place. So there's the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act of 1974, FERPA. I'm sure many of you in higher education are familiar with it. It is the privacy law that we all have to abide by. But the problem is that it provides institutions very broad, a broad argument to access, create, and use and share PII about students as long as it's in the name of improving educational services. FERPA also enables third-party service providers access to personally identifiable information when they're performing, an institutional service or function that the institution would otherwise do on its own. And so there's not a lot of protection here within the institution itself with regard to student privacy. Any protections of student privacy often are created by an institution itself. So as I have said before in other papers and other presentations, FERPA is the floor, it's not the ceiling, it's the starting point, right? So institutions build on that with other protections as they see fit. And based on my own research, empirical research with stakeholders in higher ed, many are arguing that their privacy policies are outmoded, or they're just not in existence in a way that you could say they actually protect privacy in any comprehensive way. So now I want to transition a little bit and talk about some of the research that I've done. This is empirical research. And all three of these projects were collaborative ventures. It's not something I did on my own. I was the principal investigator of data doubles and then the co-PI for the other two. They were all funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, for whom I am very thankful for their funding, because these projects wouldn't have happened without it. And the key here is that even though they're different projects, they're all focused on the same primary concern, which is student privacy. The question with data doubles was, what is a student's privacy preferences and expectations with respect to learning analytics? With prioritizing privacy, it was, what do academic librarians know about learning analytics ethics, and what gaps do we need to fill in their professional development? And the third one, the datafied classroom, was primarily focused first on faculty and questioned whether or not faculty value student privacy in the first place. And then what do faculty, instructional designers, and academic librarians do in their professional role to protect privacy with regard to data and information use in their institutions. So I'll talk about all of these going forward. So for data doubles, 3-year project, lots of research. We did 112 interviews of undergraduate students, 2,200 survey responses, and 21 focus groups with 116 students. So I'm taking 3+ years of work and distilling it down to basically 4 bullet points. So if you want more information on any of these projects, I highly suggest you go to the project pages or the OSF research repositories that I'll link to in the end. So first off, one of the major findings is that students care about their privacy. They care about the use of their personal data. There's a mythology that used to exist that I think I've debunked with my research, both individually and collaboratively with others, that students don't care about their privacy. And a lot of people say, well, students don't care about their privacy because look at how they participate on social media. No, social media is one context, and getting back to Nissenbaum again, privacy practices, behaviors, expectations, et cetera, are contextual. So we have to ask about whether or not students care about their privacy, not college-age students, which is what you will often see in the research. So students themselves care about their privacy. But the problem is they don't really have an understanding of what higher educations do, and especially academic libraries do, to protect their privacy and how they use data that's identifiable or de-identified. And even though they don't really know a heck of a lot, which you would think would be an argument to not trust a certain actor, students do trust institutions to use data in a way that benefits their education. So let's say Dennis and I don't know each other, right? But Dennis has information about me. Why should I trust Dennis to use information about me? Well, in the case of students and institutions, they go, it's okay. Just trust the institution, even though I don't know really, the wider parameters of the institution and the practices that they exhibit with regard to my data and information. But one of the key things here about that fourth bullet point is that students trust institutions to use data, but only in a way that benefits their education. So practices outside of that bubble of benefiting their education, those are suspect and they're looked negatively upon. But even though that's the case, that students trust their institution, they always express strong expectation around data usage. They wanted to be notified and consented if they could. At the least, they wanted to be notified. They wanted more awareness of institutional practices, even though they said they didn't really need a voice in those practices. They did want a voice. Decision-making power of how the personal data is used, as I wrote there. And specifically, they were concerned about third-party data usage outside of the institution. We did test that, especially in the survey, about third-party access versus institutional access, and you could see a lot of negative responses in the survey data when it comes to third parties. The next one is the prioritizing privacy study. So for the empirical part of this project, we surveyed 93 librarians in American higher education institutions. And most of them signaled that they felt, knowledgeable about research ethics specifically and data ethics as two separate factors we tested on. But 49% said that they had not received any training about learning analytics ethics specifically. And that's not really surprising to me. I mean, learning analytics really came to be in about 2010, 2011. It's fairly new. I wouldn't say that our curricula within those areas of library, information, and data science really talk specifically about learning analytics. I do in my course, but that's not all courses. And so, that there's lack of knowledge here isn't surprising. But 88% responded that they somewhat or strongly agree that they need more learning opportunities to better understand the ethical issues. And they do agree widely, 90%, that learning analytics raises specific ethical issues. And so I gave them a list of, I want to say it was like 25 different possible issues and had them rank them. And they said power imbalances is the most important issue. Algorithmic biases is the second, and self-fulfilling prophecies is the third. Just a Springs question in the Q&A. These visualizations are just random graphics that I put up there to make it a little bit more, visual than just my text. So I didn't use any visualizations for these. And then getting to the finding here. So, when 49% say, hey, I haven't received any training, and 88% say, I want more training, Lisa, who is my collaborator, Lisa Hinchliff, and I kind of jumped to that and said, okay, let's do something. Let's fill this gap. And so what we did is we built and ran an online asynchronous course, a professional development course. It was about a 6-week long course. And it was focused primarily on learning analytics, understanding learning analytics, understanding academic librarian participation, and really focusing on the student privacy issues and ethical responses. And we taught over 200 professionals across, I want to say it was 3 different cohorts, 3 different semesters to kind of fill that gap. All right, on to the third project, the datafied classroom. So again, this was focusing primarily on faculty instructors, but also looking at some librarians and instructional designers. So we surveyed 500 faculty instructors across American higher education institutions using a Qualtrics panel for that. And then we did 27 interviews across those 3 groups. So 98.9%, just rounded up to 99%, stated that student privacy was either very important or important, and no faculty indicated that their students' privacy was not important at all. So we're establishing here a baseline that says, hey, we can generalize here and say that faculty do care about student privacy, which is an empirical claim we couldn't make before. We didn't have the data on it. And 80% of those survey respondents said that they believe students as well care about their privacy. So now we've got 2 viewpoints. We have students who say, I care about my privacy. And now we have faculty instructors who say, I think students care about their privacy too. Well, if both of those stakeholder groups say that student privacy is important and both groups, care about it, then we need to be doing something about it if it's something that is valuable to both groups. However, the interview findings suggested that there's really a serious concern among stakeholders in higher ed as a result of the pivot to online education, right? When we pivoted to online education during the pandemic, a lot of new technology and new data gathering was created and used to support online ed, both synchronously and asynchronously. And so the privacy issues became more real to a lot of stakeholders. And it became something that they recognized needed to be dealt with in a systematic way, even after the pandemic, especially since a lot of those tools or practices still exist and are adopted more widely now as a result of having experience with them. But what they're also saying to us, or what they said in the interviews, was like, our policy is not up to par. Our governance practices are not there. We care a heck of a lot more about these things than we did before because it's really real to us and we know it's valuable, but the processes that we would use to protect student privacy is subpar. We need to do better than what we're doing. So again, this is the reason I put the link in the chat, or I should say Dennis did, to this presentation, because there's a lot of good papers here that I've worked on with others about these topics. And then the research repositories for each of the projects are available in OSF. I would say as well, I love these research repositories. We were very transparent with our methods and our communications. You could replicate our research very easily because all of the tools that I've provided or my teams have provided in these research repositories. Plus there's publications and presentations and white papers and survey tools and all the like. So a lot of good stuff there if you're interested in these projects. So I want to move on to the second part of this presentation, which is the role of library science, information science, and data science curricula in prioritizing privacy in professional education. So the question is like, so what, right? Kyle, you've done all this research. Good for you. It's your research agenda. It's interesting empirical evidence for some of your claims, but like, what does this have to do with LIS education? Or how does this change or create new responsibilities for student privacy? Or you might be asking yourself like, well, okay, well, what policies should we create, modify? And at what level should we be doing these things? And where in the curricula can we actually improve privacy education and research? Well, I'm glad you asked those questions because I have some ideas that I hope will generate some conversation. So first off, what does this have to do with LIS education? Well, I think the findings suggest we really need to improve our privacy education for future practitioners, right? If people are saying, especially in that prioritizing privacy project, they really don't have a lot of education, they didn't get any either in their degree or they're not getting professional development related to this topic, besides what I provided with Lisa, then we need to do more in our formal educational programs. And some of those educational needs force us to recognize that we have to talk about privacy outside of the typical areas, especially those typical areas being in relation to IRB, right? Well, we talk about confidentiality in participant privacy in relation to the IRB. And we talk about privacy a little bit in information policy, but there's a wider area of privacy that we can discuss to help inform the education of our students. I truly think that the people we teach, which are librarians, educators, data scientists, and policymakers, that they could really benefit from stronger theoretical and practical privacy education. And this is definitely true in educational context. So I know that, in information science, there are some people who are information scientists, but they are situated within educational education departments or schools. And so a lot of what I talk about is in relation to the educational context. And so taking this and putting it in an education program, I think is very relevant and useful, especially an educational technology program. So who has responsibility for student privacy? First off, I would say everyone does, but especially those who have power within an institution, and faculty and administrators have the most power, or arguably the most power within an institution, to come up with new policies or make modifications to policies that are further informed by student privacy needs and student privacy rights. And the governance within the institution is shared, right? Or at least it should be at most institutions. So as faculty, it's our responsibility with our shared governance mechanisms to bring these issues to the appropriate committees to inform the work that they do and come up with policies that are relevant. But I would also argue that the responsibility is on the sole individual faculty member when they consider, which technologies to adopt and implement in their courses, how to implement those technologies in a way that provides privacy protections to students. And usually when we make those decisions, it's about whether or not the technologies are good for instruction and for learning outcomes. And that's great. And that's probably where you should start. But you also need to roll into that, my opinion, how those practices create privacy risks for students and how you might be able to mitigate some of those risks by providing some education, some instruction, or some boundaries around how a tool could be used. And I would also like to point out, and this came out of that third project, the Datafied Classroom project, that campus stakeholders in various roles have equally various values and interests in privacy, and bringing those things all together at the table so that academic librarians and instructors and advisors can, and so on and so forth, can talk about the privacy problems that they're seeing with the tools and practices that they're using, and also talk about what their shared values are and maybe how those values may conflict at some time, so that they can find middle grounds for privacy practices and privacy policies. So what policies should we create and at what level? So I did a study with Amy Van Scoy and the Journal of Documentation, which did an analysis of LIS syllabi. So we went through all of the accredited LIS schools. We went to their website and we tried to find all of the publicly available syllabi. And where we could, we downloaded those syllabi. Where we couldn't, we contacted the directors and said, hey, we're doing this syllabi study. Would your faculty be interested in volunteering their syllabi for us to analyze in our research repository? And so we got more syllabi that way. And what we were doing is we were looking at, mentions of student privacy, and then we did a qualitative coding on those mentions. And what we found is that by and large, there's not a lot of discussion about student privacy in LIS syllabi. There was some, what I would characterize now as very good conversation about the role of privacy and intellectual freedom and how that relates to educational processes, but that was in the minority for sure. And so one of the arguments that we make in that paper is that we can do more in our syllabi because that is a policy document that we are in charge of for the most part as faculty, where we can create our own student privacy policies. So one of the things that I do in my syllabi is I describe to my students that the learning management system is collecting a lot of data. I have no control over that. There are learning analytics tools built into the system. I will only use them under certain conditions, and that's it. We use a lot of technology, especially in my database design course. And so what I tell them is that I have vetted these tools. I think they're appropriate. There are some privacy concerns, and it's your responsibility, if you are interested, to look at the privacy policies, which I've linked to. So I've done the vetting. I think it's appropriate. I think the risks are minimal. I'm telling them about that, about what I've done and where they can find more information. But that's something I do, and it's not something that as a department we've created a statement for our syllabi, but that's something departments could do. Again, related to that statement of intellectual freedom that I saw in one of the institution syllabi, I think that's really important to explain to students, but also other stakeholders within the institution, that privacy is an instrumental value, which is that it helps us achieve certain ends. That privacy helps us to access information, understand that information, come to terms with that information, and use that information to learn, to develop our values, to pursue interests. And so we need to create a space within higher education where intellectual freedom is respected. and our policies promote intellectual freedom. So that could be done, again, at a departmental level, school level, university level. One of the things I've been talking about with some other collaborators is our procurement policy. So, in our offices of information technology, where they do create the contracts for larger tools and services that we rely on, how are those policies taking into consideration larger student privacy needs? That's an area where we need more research, to be honest, but a place where we could practice privacy as faculty or instructional designers or whoever. And then our internal data governance practices should limit personally identifiable information access and improper contextual mixing. So one of the things I'm proud about at IU is we have a very good data governance practice. And we have stewards that are set up to govern different types of data sources, right? Like your registrar data or your learning management system and educational technology data or your security data. And those stewards are required to put in protections to limit access by other people within the institution and to ensure that that access, when it is granted, is proper and is in accordance with certain policies. And when there is contextual mixing, like security and educational technology or registrar, we need to ensure that that kind of contextual mixing is done in the service to improving the educational processes and outcomes for students, because that's what they are saying they require, what they want to see happen. So where in the curriculum or many types of curricula can we improve privacy education and research? So we do this already in information policy and ethics courses, but in LIS specifically, information policy and ethics courses aren't always required. As an information policy guy who teaches this and really advocates for it, I advocate for making these courses required because I think they're so essential to students, especially when they're going into certain types of librarianship or archives. Really understanding the deep nuances of privacy beyond just kind of the professional ethos around information privacy, which we do cover that professional ethos typically in introduction to or foundations of LIS. We talk about privacy in regard to IRB in our research and evaluation methods course, but I think we could do more, practically speaking, with regard to like de-identification and re-identification risks. Obviously, when we're talking about predictions and machine learning and inferential statistics and things of that nature, we're talking a lot about data management and data curation in service to doing the analysis. And that would be something that we could see improved in the data science methods courses, where we could focus more on privacy concerns as a part of the research practice. I know over the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen a lot more kind of critical data and algorithm studies courses pop up. I like that. I love that area of the literature myself. I think it would be a great seminar course to offer. And then if we could just offer a course, if we don't already do so, and I know some institutions do, but do a seminar on emerging information privacy concerns so that it's a fresh course. It stays up to date with the technology. It's theoretically rich and rigorous. And I think that could offer a lot to our curricula as well. That's all I have for you. I welcome any questions and answers. And again, thanks for spending some time with me today.
All right. I'll be the first to say thank you, Dr. Jones, for this presentation. I know I learned quite a bit throughout the course of it, and I hope those who are in attendance as well was also able to learn something. I think some of the questions were answered via the presentation itself, but there's one question to ask, which was from the first part of the presentation, which was if you could share a little bit about the visualization tools or softwares that you use to create some of the visual elements for your research.
Yeah, so I think I just mentioned that briefly and quickly in the presentation, but those graphics that you saw in the presentation itself were just images that I grabbed from Adobe stock photos to provide some color to a text-heavy presentation. But I will say, when I do visualizations on my qualitative data, I have done that using Deduce, which I don't like a lot as a qualitative research software program. I will scream to the high heavens the great things about Max QDA, which allows you to do wonderful visualizations and really deep analysis of qualitative data. And if you're interested in AI uses for analyzing qualitative data, they have AI or ChatGPT 4.1 or whatever it is these days built straight into the tool. So take a look at that.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and answer a couple general pieces of information about the university, and I will also be sending around a few pieces of information to attendees as well, including that link so that you can see the slides from today's presentation, as well as contact information in case you want to email Dr. Jones a question after today. A couple other things I'll be including will be links to the Luddy School of Informatics website, including our Library and Information Science program, if you would like to learn a little bit more about that, as well as details about the free application weekend that we have coming up. The free application weekend is something that we do every November and is going to be doable. We are still accepting applications for anyone who is interested in starting a program in spring of 2024. So if you are looking for an opportunity starting this January, you still have time for that November 15th deadline. You also heard a couple references probably about our name change. So we've gone through a couple different name changes and rebrands over the past, it feels constant, but it's been since January. So we're almost a full year into being known as the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering. Previously, we were just the School of Informatics and Computing, but we have now merged with our counterpart school in Bloomington. So we are now two schools. We are now one school on two campuses. Additionally, we are currently known as IUPUI, but that is also changing. We will soon be only known as the Indiana University Indianapolis, so IUI. That change is officially taking place on July 1st, 2024. So next summer, the Purdue part of IUPUI will be managed now through West Lafayette instead of as part of the campus. So IU Indianapolis will be its own separate campus, which is where our degree is currently housed. Already, we award IU degrees. Our faculty are all IU employees. So we're very fortunate that our program, which is 100% online, by the way. I don't think we mentioned that any other time. Our program is fully online, and we will be continuing as normal. The only differences will be that our school is going to be adding in a computer science program since Purdue's program is leaving. And we will also be eventually, long-term, adding in some engineering programs as well. So there may even be opportunities for those kinds of collaborations in those spaces for anybody who is interested with that. I'm going to go ahead and read a couple of the questions that have come into the chat as well. We have one from Melissa about how they're working for their university's Open Science Commons, and they've been tasked with creating a training module for ethical research and community-based projects. They expect privacy to be a big part of the content. So are there any recommendations for sources? Sorry, Open Scholarship Commons. I should have read the second part first. Yes, so working for the university's Open Scholarship Commons. Any recommendations for sources to be looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're talking about community-based projects or community-engaged research, one of the things that you need to be concerned about with ethical practice is just treating the participants as equals instead of subordinates, right? So they're individuals with whom you're going to enter into an agreement of some sort to do some research together as collaborators and to come up with a project or outcomes, whether that's a paper or a tool or a practice or process, whatever, to disseminate widely as collaborators. So, there's a good amount of research methodology literature on community-based research, maybe looking at like the SAGE Encyclopedia of Qualitative Research. That'd be a good place to start, and then just follow the chain of links from there about kind of the ethical elements of it.
If there are any other questions, or if anyone would like to ask a question via video or voice chat, let me know and I can promote you so that you can do those kinds of things. But we're also open to any other questions that could come in via the text Q&A feature. At the very least, you will also be receiving a recording of the presentation as well as more of those details, like I said earlier. I'm not seeing anything else coming through, so we might get a few minutes back. Okay. So I will go ahead. I will send out all of that information in the morning, so you can expect to have that for you first thing tomorrow morning. Once again, thank you, Dr. Jones, for this presentation. And to everyone, I hope you have a great rest of the conference. I think there's only one more presentation left, but I hope it's a fantastic one as well. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. And yes, cheers, everybody.
Thank you.